Sally Haslanger is full professor of philosophy in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT and an affiliate in the MIT Women's and Gender Studies program. Haslanger's works deal with topics from social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and critical race theory, using the tools of contemporary metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language. She shows that this is a fruitful combination in her well-known 2012 collection of papers, Resisting Reality, Social Construction and Social Change, published by Oxford University Press. More recently, Haslanger has been working on classical themes from social ontology and social theory, such as social practices, social structures, social change, and ideology, with an eye to identifying and developing emancipatory perspectives both in theory and in practice. The title of her talk is Social Meanings, Signs, Signals, and Scripts. So, Sally, welcome. The floor is yours.
You're muted, Sally.
Sorry, I was it's hard once you get the presentation up to find the unmute button. So thank you very much. Sorry about that. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed all the talks so far and the questions. I feel like I'm a bit of an interloper because I really do social theory. I don't do philosophy of action or philosophy of mind or cognitive science or any of those sorts of things. And so the normative dimension of what I'm going to say is very, very rough. And I borrow quite a bit from Kristen Andrews in doing it. But so it's very drafty what I'm trying to offer and sort of seeing how these different issues sort of fit together. Okay, so let's see where I am. Here's my outline. I'm going to have a very brief introduction. I'm going to talk then about social practice structures and systems, so you can see why I'm interested in mind shaping. Then I'm going to talk about social meaning and signaling and these sorts of things. And actually, it's going to be about fluency. Then I'll say a little bit about normativity, or my best guess so far about normativity and how it emerges here. And then I'll draw a conclusion. Okay, so let's do the introduction. So patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, cis heteronormativity, ableism, carnism or speciesism, where carnism is the ideology that we can eat and kill and eat animals and treat them and kill them for leather or whatever. And other oppressive systems are exceptionally durable, even in the face of pressure to change. So then there's the question that has really been guiding me for quite a long time, is how and why do oppressive systems reproduce themselves? And how can the process of social reproduction be effectively transformed so that hopefully better systems emerge? And in this talk, I'm really going to focus on A, how and why do the systems reproduce themselves? And more specifically, on how social norms contribute to the durability of oppression. So I'm someone who believes that social niche construction is that, how to understand our social lives. And there are many different dimensions of the social niche, but certainly social norms are part of it. Okay, so this is, if anyone has heard me give a talk before, you've probably heard this. So I apologize for that, but it does structure a lot of my thinking. So coordination happens in social practices, coordination around what I call resources, that is things of positive or negative value, is a fundamental human task. And our ability to develop flexible forms of coordination that can be passed down through social learning is the key to our evolutionary success. And I want to include in what we coordinate around negative things like toxic waste or garbage and such. That may seem odd to call it resources, but that is what the tradition that I'm part of has used. And so I use that term too. Sometimes I call them sources instead of resources, but oh well. Coordination relies on meanings and symbols and default assumptions and associations. That is culture, or what I call a cultural techne, to shape our behavior. We not only learn what is edible, but develop cuisines, menus, and daily and holiday rituals. So here's a cedar waxwing, and a cedar waxwing has a pre-installed module that tells it that it eats little red round things, and it will try to eat little red beads or whatever. It doesn't have to learn this from its parents or anything, where we do have to learn what things are edible and what things are not edible. On my account, an ideology is a cultural technique gone wrong. So it's these tools that are part of this toolbox of meanings, symbols, default assumptions. It's gone wrong because it obscures or distorts what is valuable and or organizes us in unjust or harmful ways. So any human behavior is conditioned by multiple factors. So let's consider a meal. It's constrained by the physical demands of the human body, the geographical context and the edible things in it, the social, political, legal context that makes certain edibles salient or available or safe. So, government institutions which make sure that certain poisonous things can't be included in our food, things like that. Whoops, I've lost my clicker. There it is. The economic constraints on what we can afford and the social meaning of the different foodstuffs. So, we all know that what we eat at certain times of day or in certain holiday rituals and things like that is really important, because that's something that culture teaches. You have coffee in the morning when you get up. You have, in the United States, you have turkey at Thanksgiving. These sorts of things are very significant. And for a wedding, you're supposed to have these things and not that. At a holiday banquet or a celebratory banquet, you have other things. So social meaning is an important factor that conditions our behavior. So a cultural techne, I think of as, at this point in my thinking about it, is just a grab bag. I'm sure that more work could be done to make clearer what's in it. But I want to include simple meanings like pink means girl, red means stop, and other forms of signaling like greeting rituals. Do you shake hands or do you bow? Clothing choices, so gendered clothing choices, for example, different kinds of logos. Default assumptions, marriages between one man and one woman, or concepts. I think that these default assumptions are often alleged analytic truths about the concepts. I don't believe in analytic truths, but I do think that there are these default assumptions that can be challenged. Elements of architectural design, so toilets designed for men and women only. Brick and ivy in the United States, especially in New England, means an elite Ivy League school. Facade columns is supposed to connect you to, the Western tradition of Greece and our glorious past. Narrative tropes, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage, and material signs, signals, prompts, familiar patterns of metaphor and metonymy. The pen is mightier than the sword. Entrenched conceptual homologies like reason is to passion as man is to woman, and explicit declarations and coded messages like Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. So what I'm trying to get at is these are the various parts of culture that we master in order to become socially fluent. And so just as there are going to be bits of it that are kind of semantic, so you want to know what pink means around here, there are going to be other things that are more pragmatic. This is what you assume as a background when you encounter someone who is marked with this particular signal. So if a child or an infant is marked with pink, there are certain kinds of, and so that indicates that it's a girl, then there's certain default assumptions are triggered, et cetera, et cetera. And the same is true, like architectural design is like a simple meaning. It says this is where men or women use the toilet. Okay, so here we are trying to organize. We are undifferentiated and along multiple dimensions, so we have to coordinate. And so my account of practices suggests that when we're trying to coordinate, there's the thing in the world that we interpret through various frameworks. Is it a pet? Is it food? Is it a pelt? Is it a wild animal? And once we opt for a particular social meaning, then we develop attitudes. We come to perceive relevant things about it, etc. So if we're in a world where the social meaning is that bunnies are food, then we will perceive the bunny as something to be caught and something to be killed and something to be cooked. If that culture, if you go into a culture where then bunnies are pets, there's going to be a kind of dislocation, a sense of what's going on here, because people grow these big fat bunnies and put them on their laps and keep them in their homes, and you're kind of confused by it. And what the cultural techne offers us as a way of thinking about the world or experiencing the world is reinforced by how we interact with the resources. So, oops, sorry, I keep going back. This is also connected to whether, can you still see me? I think I've lost.
You share the screen. We cannot see the slide.
Okay, I thought something happened. That was very weird. I don't know what happened as it unshared. Okay, here we go. Go back to sharing. Go back to presenting. Okay, there we are. So this, is this individual a friend, a mother, or a sex object? Is this individual a friend, a janitor, or a criminal? Okay, so social practices and words are patterns of learned behavior that, at least in the primary instances, enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource or multiple resources due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resources in question, as interpreted through these schemas. So notice that learned behavior is a crucial thing here that makes it social. Again, compared to the bird, we learn what is edible. So this is where mind shaping is going to start playing a role. Social learning is a crucial part of making something a social practice, as opposed to just an innate disposition. So public meanings are internalized as we learn the languages of our local cultures. This is the basis for our fluency in social skills and capacities for code switching. I share some cultural tools with philosophical colleagues, such as all of you across the globe, others with my neighbors, and still others with my dog. Tools are designed for one purpose and then are used for another purpose. This is a Levi-Straussian idea. So red gets used in all of these different ways and has different meanings. It can mean protest, it can mean love, it can mean, AIDS support, etc. And as William Sewell says, who's a cultural historian, says users of a culture will form a semiotic community in the sense that they will recognize the same set of oppositions, or my term here is meanings, and therefore be capable of engaging in mutually meaningful symbolic action. To use the ubiquitous linguistic analogy, they'll be capable of using the grammar, I think also the syntax, the lexicon, etc., of the semiotic system to make understandable utterances. So our everyday activities and actions and what we wear and how we move through space, our embodiment, there is a language for doing that, so to speak. So social relations are established in practices. So X is the friend of Y, or the teacher of Y, or the parent of Y. We engage in these practices that are mediated through the cultural techne. Structures are networks of relations. They consist of places and nodes, places and relations, or nodes and edges. And the network forms the skeleton of a complex dynamic system. And I can talk at length about complex dynamic systems, but that's not my topic for today. But I think part of the issue is that these complex dynamic systems are self-reinforcing. So if we want to bring about social change, we have to figure out about how to intervene in them. Transformative social change occurs when systems no longer produce the equilibrium. Instead, positive feedback loops lead to a new equilibrium and that new equilibrium is sustained homeostatically. So to do this, to have transformative social change, we need to understand the basins of attraction and tipping points, because systems can accommodate perturbations and maintain themselves. That's the bad side. But the good side is small changes can cascade and make a significant difference. So here are these different equilibrium points. So on the left is the bowl. And so that's going to, you can move that ball a lot, and it's not going to make a significant difference. It's going to return to the base equilibrium. But if you can change the conditions to the second example, then what happens is even a small change can have a substantial difference. And either way, right or left. And so we're trying to change the bowl to the hilltop to get social change to happen. And then there's an unstable equilibrium point where you have to push really hard to go one way and a tiny tap to go in the other way. And so this is like American democracy. We're having to push really hard to sustain democracy, but a tiny push is going to have democracy collapse, I think. Okay, positive feedback loops, you get the idea. I don't have to go into that. So social structures are stable and dynamic. Our systems are dynamic, but tend to be stable. Why are they stable? Well, coordination is really important. We have to coordinate to survive, and it depends on communication, a division of labor, and apt usage of the tools provided by the cultural techne in order to communicate and divide labor. Without uptake of the cultural techne, coordination falls apart. It also is due to intelligibility. A cultural techne provides tools to make sense of ourselves and of others in the world. Action that conforms to one's place in a social practice is intelligible to others, but if one strays too far, one is misinterpreted or punished or viewed as a questionable member of the community, and this is bad, right? This is, for humans, not belonging is really one of the most upsetting things that can be done to us. And so we're highly motivated to do what enables us to belong. Of course, I want to emphasize materiality, because in the social niche, practices shape the material conditions in ways that resist change. Feedback loops and social needs construction shape our environment to accommodate our practices. So I think transportation systems are a great example. It's really hard to change a transportation system once it's in place. And so we are shaped to use certain kinds of transportation systems and lose skills about how to use other ones. And it takes a lot to be able to shift that. Even if we want and need to change our practices, it may not be feasible because it may be just way too expensive. And also power. So practices define roles that come with burdens and benefits. This is part of the division of labor. And in doing so, they distribute power. Who has access to the valued stuff, who can produce it, own it, withhold it, and who is burdened with responsibility. So here, as I mentioned today, we're going to talk about social norms and the cultural techne, and I'll say less about materiality and power. So meaning, signaling, and uptake. So what kind of strategy will help us think about how the cultural techne shapes us, right? Because it's a mind shaping, it happens through the cultural techne. So how does the cultural techne structure our agency? So I'm going to begin with the idea of fluency in a system of signs, knowing how to read the signs, how to use them to interpret each other in the environment, how to use them as guides to behavior. So fluency is a kind of know-how. And so I actually believe that a system of signs is a material thing in the world. And what we do so like a language is a material thing in the world, it has a lot of abstract structural dimensions, but signs are material things. They're like most of them, not all of them. They're sequences of letters. They are sounds that come out of our mouths. They are signs that we put on the street. And then there's a kind of structure to them that makes them a system. So I suggest that we start by drawing on resources and communication more generally to make sense of social norms, and of course, in the bad cases, to make sense of ideology. Semantics or semiotics relies on a material apparatus of symbols, which are the sounds, inscriptions, and meaningful objects, and gives them a referent or a meaning. So here's the terminology of semiotics. I think in some ways it's more useful than the analytic philosophy of language terminology because it has different words for sign and signifier. So the signifier is like the DOG at the bottom, and the signified is a dog. You have to imagine that being a real dog rather than a picture of a dog. So dog, the signifier picks out the animal, the dog, and then the combination of the signified and the signifier is the sign. So for Althusser and for others, a semiotics has this apparatus. This is going to be important, the signal. And the signal is the signifier, and then it has signification, and so becomes a sign. And the signified is the meaning. So here's someone, the priest holding up the host. That's a little cracker. The little cracker is the signifier, and what it means is the body of Christ. And it is part of a ritual, but also part of a system of signs that, connects this different things that are signified in relation to each other. The meaning of the signifier is what it picks out. It is not in the head. So I'm an externalist about semantics. It's part of a system of signs, which is the full apparatus of the liturgy. We learn the language and become fluent social agents. We learn how to use the language, use the system of signs. And the relationship between signifier and signified is also going to be a potential site of contestation. What is the real meaning of the host? Is there anything that it corresponds to, or is that just fiction? Is this system a system we endorse for coordination, etc.? Okay, so how do you get from signifier to signified? The standard view comes from Grice, metasemantics. So it's not the semantics, it's how the signified gets its semantic value. This is metasemantics. So Grice introduces a distinction between non-natural meaning, so dogs means dogs, and he says of non-natural meaning that a speaker A meant non-naturally something by X is roughly equivalent to A intended the utterance of X to produce some effect in an audience by means of the recognition of this intention. So note that non-natural meaning requires sophisticated metacognition. It's not plausible that non-human animals can have access to non-natural meaning in the Gricean sense. But there's also, Grice talks about natural meaning. So one example is smoke means fire, and the meaning is established through regularity of cause and effect. And I think that such meaning seems to rely simply on an individual's inductive capacities. So you see fire and then there's smoke, and you see fire and then there's smoke, and then you see fire and there's smoke, and then you see smoke and you think, oh, there must be a fire. So it's tempting to think that there's some form of meaning that's less cognitively demanding than Grice's non-natural meaning, but more socially demanding than natural meaning. So here is an idea of meaning or signaling without metacognition. So Grice, this is from a passage from Grice. Grice says, well, my view is contrasted with Stevenson. So Grice is going to quote Stevenson. Grice says, for something X to mean non-naturally something Y, it's not non-naturally. It's naturally. It shouldn't be NN, it should be N. So for something X to mean naturally something Y, speakers have a tendency to produce X, and hearers have a tendency to understand Y when speakers want to communicate Y to hearers. And this pattern is due to, according to Stevenson, an elaborate process of conditioning attending to the use of sign in communication. So it's just a conditioning process rather than this fancy, I intend that you understand my intention by doing this. It's just a conditioning process that's going on in natural meaning Grice has in mind. So Okay, how did that happen? Okay, so Brian Skirms works on signals. Hello. Okay, Skirm says, Darwin seems some kind of natural salience operating at the origin of language. At that point, signals are not conventional, but rather the signal is somehow naturally suited to convey its content. This is the smoke means fire. But then there's a kind of further meaning, which isn't just simple, natural salience or induction, but it involves what Stevenson seemed to be thinking about in terms of conditioning. And then, so Skirms goes on, signaling is gradually modified by evolution. Darwin is thinking of biological evolution, but for humans and some other species, there's a version of the account that substitutes cultural evolution or social learning for biological evolution. So what's going to happen here is we can get some kind of meaning that is more than just, a kind of natural suitedness through induction for smoke means fire, but there's a kind of conditioning that happens through social learning that enables us to read a signal. Okay, so here's vervets. So vervets are the standard example for creatures that are non-human that have culture. And that's what I'm interested here, because I think that culture is not something that just humans have. Lots and lots and lots of animals have culture in the sense that they socially learn signals, patterns of behavior, scripts, and these sorts of things that enable them to coordinate. If they didn't, they would be very easily extinct, because climate change and all sorts of other change in the world make it the case that there has to be resilience and flexibility in animal behavior, and animal coordination. So vervets have distinct alarm calls for different classes of predator, a cough for an eagle, a bark for a leopard, and a chutter for a snake. For each predator, a different evasive action is optimal. For leopards, it's best to run up the tree and out on a branch where a leopard can't follow. For snakes, one should stand tall and scan the ground to locate it and move away. For eagles, it's best to exit a tree, take cover in the underbrush, and look upward to detect the location of the predator. And each alarm call elicits the appropriate behavior. So this is the kind of conditioning, but it is learned conditioning. So vervets can also learn the calls of birds, and respond appropriately to their warnings as eavesdroppers. So what happens is the vervets learn that when the superb starling makes a certain call, then that means that there's a leopard, and so then they give their vervet call. And there are also some examples of using these calls deceptively, like to get everyone up in the tree. So this is the signal system. The sender sees an eagle and coughs. The receiver hears the cough and runs to the underbrush, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, where am I here? The vervet cough has social meaning in the vervet group. Social meaning of this sort does not require sophisticated mental states and metacognition, and neither the carrier of the social meaning, that is the signifier, nor the information transmitted need be linguistic, right? It's a cough and it's a leopard, right? There's nothing linguistic there if you think of languages as these complex recursive systems. Nevertheless, information is transmitted, specifically information that's relevant to agency. And note that understanding the signal involves knowing what to do, what we do, what one ought to do. This is part of the question of where normativity comes in. Whoopsie. Now I am. Okay. So normativity. My little controllers at the bottom. There they are. Okay. Normativity. So one way to approach the topic of normativity is to start with a conception of the psychological requirements. I know I'm almost out of time. What does it take for someone to feel the pressure of a norm or to follow a norm? Those are looking at normativity from the point of view of humans to start with. And this is a human-centric, because we say, look, what do I feel when I'm feeling pressured by norms or when I'm following a norm? But I don't think that I think this is speciesist, and I think that we shouldn't take this approach. Instead, as Andrews says, this is Kristen Andrews, rather than defining norms in terms of human psychology, it's possible to characterize normative regularities in a minimally psychological way that presupposes very little about their underlying mechanism, instead focuses on readily operationalized patterns of behavior. This approach would permit researchers to first identify normative regularities and then develop a bottom-up taxonomy of all the different kinds of psychological processes that bring them about. So very briefly, normative regularities, she suggests, are socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity within a community. And so there's an open question here, for example, of the fish. Is this pattern sort of innately sort of pre-programmed? So when there is a predator, then fish just go into this, or did they have to learn it? This is an open question. Conformity is simply a pattern of behavior that is statistically common, but social maintenance is what makes it a normative regularity. It can come in different forms, not just punishment or sanctions, but also positive incentives such as inclusion, gains in status, success in gaining another common good, so food. So an incentive would be we cooperate to get food. Community is just going to be the relevant reference group. So socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity within a community are the normative regularities. They happen all over the place, all over the animal world. Many argue even in insects and kind of very primitive animals. But this is the beginning. And then we say, what are the many social and psychological processes that maintain behavioral conformity within different species? Now, this next slide looks very complicated. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. So she argues that there are these 6 different dimensions of normativity. There's going to be, whether there's broadly speaking, rule following, where she doesn't mean just like rule following in a kind of Kripke, Wittgenstein sense, but just a rule can be provided that patterns the behavior. Behavioral understanding, that is understanding others in conspecifics when they signal, etc. Collective agency, how collective is the participation in this practice. What is your motivation? Is there punishment? Is there active pedagogy? And she suggests that there are these different levels of behavioral rules that can be just emergent regularities, implicit representations, non-propositional representations, etc., all the way up to public linguistic representations of rules, which is humans. Similarly, their behavioral interpretation and prediction of other conspecifics. You can have submentalistic behavior understanding. This is probably the way that infants and many animals, non-human animals, do it, but there can be minimal mentalizing. So predators will have minimal mentalizing. This is what Zawadzki calls the teleological stance, and then all the way up to humans and recursive mentalizing. Collective agency, we can do this just because we all want, a group of us want the same thing and we're just pursuing our own self-interest, and it ends up that our doing it at the same time is productive of something that we want or need. It could be coordinated, shared, etc. Is our motivation immediate self-interest, or are we reciprocally altruistic? Are we concerned with our reputation? Do we take it to be intrinsically motivating? What is the kind of punishment? Just second person, you hurt me and I punch you. Third person, there's someone else who comes in and says, no, you can't do that to them. So bystander. Or is there an institution of punishment? And the same pedagogy, there's going to be sort of selective social toleration. So this comes in Zawadzki's work too, so that I will let you watch me do this and not push you away. But that other member of the tribe or the group or the whatever, I won't let them watch me. So I'm just going to let you do it so that you learn it. active feedback, etc. Institutional teaching. So I think that we can say that vervets demonstrate behavioral regularity such as signaling that is socially maintained, but it doesn't seem to involve explicit representations, or it's not even clear it involves implicit representations or metacognition. So on these, I think maybe implicit, certainly non-propositional. I think their interpretation of this is vervets learning how to open a box and teaching each other how to open boxes and such. There's probably submentalistic understanding of this is all what we do too, to be honest. It's not like they're so different from us. We do all this too. Minimal mentalizing, collective agency. It seems like in the signaling, there's coordinated intentionality because one gives the signal and the other runs away. Immediate self-interest is going to be like you run up the tree because you have a self-interest in not being eaten by a leopard, but there's a reciprocal process here because the signal giver and the signal receiver are reciprocally involved. And certainly the parent of the small vervet who is trying to teach the vervet to run up the tree when this call happens, that's going to be reciprocally altruistic. There's active feedback, active teaching and correction, and punishment. There's, in some of their activities, it seems that there's both second person and third person punishment. So what I want to say about this is that what I think is so valuable about this approach is that there's this multidimensional sort of model. So if we go back, if I can get back to that, I won't go back to it, but you remember the picture. There's the picture. So the picture is that you can map different kinds of animals and different kinds of activities as normative in these, greater or lesser ways along these multiple dimensions. Okay, almost done. If I can get the screen to work. Okay, conclusion. So how and why do oppressive systems reproduce themselves? In a social niche, an equilibrium is achieved through the interaction between physical constraints, social signals, behavioral affordances, power dynamics, etc. So this equilibrium is well maintained by multiple feedback loops between our behavior and the material conditions. I focused here on the cultural techne as a bucket of signs and signals and scripts. Social fluency in the cultural techne involves an uptake of these tools for coordination. To know what the sign means is to know how to act in conformity with it and to do so as a default, or at least pro tanto sort of disposition to do it that way. Because there's a correct and incorrect way to respond to the signal, by taking up a system of signals, we become fluent in a normative structure. And sophisticated mind reading and propositional representation is not necessary. How can the process of social reproduction be effectively transformed so that better systems emerge? Disrupt the equilibrium, and among other things, we should change our cultural techne. Thank you.